Hello and welcome to Super Bunny Hop, a channel that covers the depressing realities of the video game industry. So with that being said, let's talk about VR. There is a degree of conditionality to the claims I must lay out here before I get to the dream scenario later on, and that is that Nintendo has decided to enter into what kind of feels like the twilight of current gen VR with the most introductory of introductions to VR. The Labo VR headset kits retail at a starting price of $40, and, well, you kinda get what you pay for. Their strategy goes deep into the dirt cheap, releasing a cardboard VR kit that requires heavy assembly from users and heavy disassembly from moisture, and this may actually be a sign VR companies need to consider if they're ever gonna sell these things on a mass market scale with the massively popular killer app that normal people out on the street are gonna wanna play. The similar Google Cardboard sold like hotcakes back in 2017, but the trend since then has been a downward decline in hardware sales. But VR itself is still a thing. XR market share is still increasing, well-reviewed PSVR exclusives keep coming out, the Oculus Quest just released to great reviews, and Valve is set to spearhead the next gen of high-end VR equipment. The VR party is not over, as also evidenced by Nintendo taking a stab at this. This is yet another reminder that the Labo product line is a teaching toy for children who are far younger than what YouTube tells me is the average age demographic for my videos. This is arguably designed more for demystifying VR and teaching kids how these electronics work, rather than serving as a fully functional headset of its own, even though it is a surprisingly sturdy and functional headset of its own. The problems arise mostly from the software side of things. The $40 kit also comes with a giant cardboard gun you play with in some carnival rail shooter games with some production values that are of a similar level to those made for additional accessory controllers included in the $80 kit, but if you want to play more regular games with more regular controllers, you'll be dealing with some garage mode made prototypes that are pretty underwhelming for so-called adults such as ourselves.
Yeah, try to put on cutesy sounds of like this fucking torture chamber.
It looks like a normal dog to me though. Jump, boy. Oh, no. That's not jumping.
Oh, his head fell off. What the fuck is this? Like, I'd imagine giving this to a kid and them having fucking nightmares.
Labo VR shines on its own with its own custom-built cardboard controllers, but when scratching the surface of the outside world, we can get some glimpses at just how right and wrong Nintendo's most venerable franchises could go, with Mario and Zelda. Mario Odyssey's VR levels play like basic Mario Odyssey levels, but from a fixed head-tracked camera that just doesn't move. But it was Zelda in particular, not just any Zelda, but the latest, the greatest, the prettiest and most demanding and longest Zelda ever, getting a full-length, not a demo, real-deal VR mode, that got my mind racing, to see whether or not they could honor a promise that sounded too good to be true. And it turns out that Zelda VR mode is super underwhelming for accessibility and performance problems, but also because the entire methodology of this game's camera work is not great for VR for reasons that are better shown visually than explained with words. So please, allow me to demonstrate here in my gamer chair. This is the coolest freaking thing about VR that no one freaking talks about. Dolphin VR. A version of a Gamecube and Wii emulator that uncouples the game's camera from its original rails to follow your head-tracking movements with a more one-to-one motion-controlled philosophy. And since many Nintendo 64 games got re-released for the Nintendo Wii, some real ancient classics from the turn of the millennium are available to play in a surprisingly more effective VR mode than Nintendo's official offerings. And Dolphin VR reveals something incredibly fun and satisfying about playing old games again in VR. It's seeing familiar, beloved locations from new perspectives. Perspectives where places actually have a sense of size, scale, and presence, and, let's be frank, a much better camera system than the wonky, single-stick, digital-controlled camera of the primitive frontier that was early 3D gaming. Plug these games into Dolphin VR and you'll discover a camera fix they always needed, as well as a bit of evidence that a lot of third-person genres work a lot better in VR than a lot of consumers give them credit for. Just a little bit of neck stick movement, instead of a bunch of button presses, suddenly reveals what's around your character, how big these characters and levels were always supposed to be, and how and why levels are designed the way they are. And for a kid growing up in the 90s who saw Ocarina of Time as a giant benchmark in the development of video gaming itself, this experience feels almost magical. It really looks like there's a little papercraft Link in front of me. He's about 3-4 inches high, standing on a surface that's surprisingly close to where the desk is. I would happily pay a premium for a more polished version of this. Mostly because, in order to adjust the game speed for VR, the emulator makes the third dungeon actually unbeatable. But take and switch my childhood affinity for Ocarina for any other N64 Gamecube era hits, and Nintendo is still likely to see countless potential for virtual reality-enabled nostalgia resales. It's no less magical seeing a little papercraft Mario bop around a room that feels like a toy Lego set come to life. F-Zero GX could make the switch to VR beautifully without needing to change a damn thing. Paper Mario plays just as well in VR, but your new perspective gives the game's literally theatrical aesthetics a whole new tone, and a whole new way to explore the environment.
I cannot allow you to go any further.
Everywhere is some kind of example of what could be, something that makes too much sense not to capitalize on. Star Fox 64 works surprisingly well, but the game plays just a bit too fast and hectic to stick to the cockpit. Pokemon Snap barely works at all in this emulator, but it evokes the very passive and entirely first-person experiences that VR is perfectly suited for. It's no wonder so many fans requested a VR version. It's a concept teased in their official products. I think they have to know who they're teasing with this stuff. Furthermore, VR isn't all perspective novelties. Head-tracking camera and aiming controls can make it easier to visually track flanking enemies who are coming in from the screen's peripheral vision. It can be used to better judge jumping distances and track down puzzle pieces. The HMD is as much an extension of the player's body as a controller, and using your neck as another piece of your controller further blurs the line between that feeling of immersion and that feeling of solid, responsive, intuitive control. And for old-school, low-poly games from the 90s, VR also introduces a unique feeling of novelty as well. A sci-fi dream from the 90s come true, a real-life version of what was going through kids' heads when playing these things for the first time 20 years ago. These kinds of novelties have been Nintendo's bread and butter for years. The kind of nostalgic novelties, especially suited to demographics with more disposable income. Except this time, the technological gap between playing Ocarina in virtual reality versus the Nintendo 64 is way more impressive than playing it on the Virtual Console versus the N64. So that's backing number one, despite the qualifications and the limitations I have to acknowledge. Old-ass Nintendo games are already super fun to play in Dolphin VR. It's freaking magical. Reason number two is that the uniquely old-school graphics of Nintendo's uniquely retrograde properties are uniquely suited to the uniquely underpowered specs of their current-gen console. The Switch will never be able to output VR games that look like they're from the current generation, and even coming close to attempting that is one of the things that I think made their VR version of Zelda so underwhelming. This is an art style that is not meant to be seen from a lower resolution. Especially one that further hides details behind the screen door effect of a close-up view of a screen's pixel grid. Colors bleed together, the stuff in the distance gets blurred out, and curved surfaces turn into shimmering, jagged staircase lines. Low-poly VR isn't exactly something that's easy to advertise to outsiders, but it does have its VR enthusiasts for good reason. An art style comprised of straight diagonal lines instead of curves, an art style with a lot of flat shading and solid colors where long-distance visibility is never a priority in the first place, that stuff is better suited to the limitations of current-gen VR than more realistic art styles. This gives Nintendo hits from 20 years ago a kind of urgency to be resold in this medium right now, before photorealistic VR games make a lot of the current advantages of low-poly VR moot. I'm not qualified to accurately speculate on the science behind the Switch's technical specs and how well it could handle VR versions of these games. Even on PC, frame rates vary wildly depending on which game you're emulating and what scenes are being rendered, but there is one commonality, one really apparent trend. Yeah, looks like we're getting about a jillion more FPS here than in frickin' Subnautica. If they can make this happen on screen at 60 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch, then surely that hardware can do the version of Mario from 23 years ago. I'm actually getting enough extra frames here to crank up the resolution to super sampling and ramp up anti-aliasing to sharpen that image even further. And as you do, those bright colors and jagged curves go a long way towards making a clean, blur-free image. It's weird. It's really weird how much sharper and cleaner Mario 64 looks through these goggles than Mario Odyssey. So, my first big reason is that this stuff has already proven itself to be damn good fun through fan-made projects. My second reason is that it's not going to stress the Switch's hardware. My third reason is that there's nothing really here in this package that they've already released that makes it impossible. Okay, fine. So there's a few setbacks that make this improbable. First and foremost being the lack of an elastic strap for longer sessions. I mean, the shape of these hard plastic protrusions and cardboard corners isn't well suited for digging into your face skin. But fortunately, any elaborate IR controller tracking and gyroscopic controllers themselves aren't required to re-enjoy gameplay from 20 years ago with games that have a camera system that's only really going to make use of the gyroscope of the Switch tablet strapped to your face. No extra controller solutions are required, and neither is another critical VR feature that the Switch's setup also lacks: positional tracking. You just need rotational tracking. Those are two different things. You only need 3 degrees of freedom here. The next step up is having 6 degrees of freedom, enabled by tracking where the headset is positioned on top of planet Earth itself, using sensors either mounted outside, away from the headset, or inside the headset itself. But the thing is, in my experience, positional tracking can get away with being an underutilized feature in conventional gaming genres like this, where the thing your head embodying is either a camera that is always going to be floating at a fixed distance behind a character, or a cockpit that's always going to be at a fixed position as well, and in both cases, the thing that you're controlling is primarily going to be controlled by buttons rather than your body. Positional tracking is important for VR-specific genres requiring full-body movement, but not for more traditional genres where most movement, and more specifically camera movement, is still mappable to a traditional controller. In theory, positional tracking is supposed to be one of the last steps needed to get your head achieving that full-body immersion that's so important for VR experiences, but in practice, in my experience, tinkering with Dolphin VR, positional tracking didn't make that much of a difference. It's less of a meaningful gameplay addition than it is a optional feature that helps prevent motion sickness. A problem that is ironically solved by them not including a head strap in the first place, which forces players to take this thing off on a second-by-second, minute-by-minute basis, naturally preventing the motion sickness that comes from longer sessions of being fully strapped in, where your brain eventually can't adapt to the imperfections of the sensory inputs it's getting. You get what you pay for with this thing. It's only $40, but as it turns out, no more than $40 of extra value is needed to play these old games in a beautiful new way like this. Lacking hardware for positional tracking may not be ideal, but in this scenario, that's not really necessary either. Which brings me to my third and final point, and probably the shakiest because it's really me just being miserly, but based on what we got right now, there's nothing really making this impossible. At this point, making the dream happen is more a matter of business and marketing strategies and finding the budget for all this than it is hardware limitations. These games come from an era where preserving the source code was not common, and the problems with this emulator already show that the frame rate baked gameplay of many N64 games is going to mean that emulation itself is going to be out of the question. There will be significant development budgets involved. Cutscenes and menus and mechanics may have to be remade for VR, but Nintendo has shown themselves willing to do remakes before, and pretty damn good ones at that. The difference is, this time, I feel like there's a much more impressive gap to leap and many more gains to make for a remake than by simply pumping up the graphics for the next console. Virtual reality is a new way to see, play, and experience traditional methods of gaming, and that means that traditional, genre-defining classics are absolutely worth revisiting as well.